And without further ado, I'd like to hand things over to Paul Wheeler to get things underway. Paul, take it away.
Thanks, Ian. As Ian said, my name is Paul Wheeler. I am the chair of the Board of Trustees of Community Services Benefits Trust. I want to make sure everybody's aware that I'm actually not an insurance guy. I'm an old executive director, social worker, and an Anglican priest. And I spent about 40 years senior positions at various community services organizations in Ontario and British Columbia. So that's my sort of claim to fame. I want to say how proud we are to have a close relationship with Community Living Ontario. I think we've done great work together, and our board really values the fact that we're allowed to support CLO in its important work in the community. So thank you for that to Community Living Ontario. One of the things I want to point out is that in my 40 years of doing the work that I did, one of the things that I realized fairly early on actually is that the only real resource a community living or other community services organization has, the only real resource is its staff. If we're going to get the work done that we need done, if people are going to get the support that they need, it's going to happen because the staff of the organization make it happen. And one of the things I also found out fairly early on is that when somebody's sick and off work for any period of time, especially a longer period of time, we tend to lose track of them, and we don't support our staff the way they really need to be supported during those kind of periods. And I was always really concerned about that and struggled with how to do it better. In 1999, I learned about this little organization in Maple Ridge, British Columbia called the Disability Management Institute. And our agency started working with them in 1999. We paid a little bit of money per staff per month in order to do that. We couldn't really afford it, but it was amazing the difference it made really very quickly with us reporting early on that somebody was off sick and DMI getting involved in helping them navigate the medical system, if they needed treatment, helping them get treatment, all of those kind of things. It's amazing how it improved morale, provided better outcomes, and equally importantly, saved our organization money because people came back to work much more quickly when they were ready. One of the things that I didn't do very well at that time is DMI would come to us and say, you know, you have a duty to accommodate, and you got to accommodate this person to come back to work. And I'd say, well, you know, they work in a group home. And if you're going to work in a group home, you have to do everything that a person does in a group home. And so we can't really accommodate. And I had to spend time learning about what that's really all about and how to do it properly. And DMI was, for us at least, invaluable in making that kind of thing work for both employees and employer. So when we launched CSBT in 2002, one of the things we said right from the start is this DMI thing has to be part of every organization's benefit package as long as they have LTD with us. And our administrator, Group Health, found a way to make that happen with no additional costs to the employer. And it's been incredibly successful in terms of helping keep LTD costs down while helping employees have much better outcomes when they're off sick or disabled in any kind of way. The only thing I want to point out about that, by the way, there is a time that Disability Management Institute doesn't work, and that's if you don't use it. If you don't report to DMI that your employee's off sick, then it isn't going to make any difference because they can't get involved and help if they don't know that this is happening. And I'm sure you'll hear more about that in this presentation. So we're going to talk about duty to accommodate today. I'm glad you're here. I think it's really important, this particular topic. I think it makes a huge difference to our colleagues and certainly to the people that we support in our organizations if we get staff back to work more quickly, more ably, and happy to be there. So over to you, Stephanie and Megan. Thank you for doing this presentation today.
Well, thank you, Paul, for that wonderful introduction. Just in what you said, I think there's about 3 topics for follow-up presentations that we can do on what services DMI offers. But today we're focusing on the duty to accommodate. And what I liked about what you said is that, you know, in some way, everybody knows that employers have a duty to accommodate, but it's the how, the why. and who, you know, where does your responsibility start and end? And that's what we're going to try and clarify today. And by clarify, I hope you get just a little sense of, okay, I understand this better, because it is a complex topic. We could spend days on this, and there are legalities involved. So we'll get into that a little bit. Before we begin, though, I just want to take a moment for all of us to consider the traditional territories of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people on which each of us may be tuning in from today. Please take some time to acknowledge and think about our relationship to the land, animals, creatures, water, and people that we engage with daily. Throughout the discussion today, we are going to poll you. So please have your phone handy or your tablet or computer. You can either open up a web browser and type slido.com, or you can scan the QR code on the screen. You'll be prompted with a blue box asking you to enter a code. Enter the code that's on your screen, 3078613, and maybe Eon, just to give time for people to do all of that, maybe put the code and the website in the chat. That would be super helpful. So today, when we're talking about the duty to accommodate, what we're going to focus on, we're going to start with an introduction of what is the duty to accommodate. We're going to review DMI's role in supporting you, as well as decipher your role as the employer. And finally, we're going to look at some of the benefits of accommodations and ideas to implement them. We won't have time to go into detail about specific accommodations that would fit your reality and your workplace, because that would be an entire other topic. And one thing I really hope you retain from today's presentations is that, unfortunately, there's no magic wand. No accommodation fits everyone. It has to be done on a one-on-one basis. So that's super important to remember. So what is the duty to accommodate? It's basically, as you know, it's a legislation that says that Canadian employers have a legal duty to accommodate protected grounds to the point of undue hardship. And we will get into what undue hardship means. And sorry, as outlined in this duty to accommodate legislation, we have to keep in mind that it is part of the Human Rights Act of Canada. So there are some protected grounds. It varies from province to province, but one of the common elements that is always included is that protected grounds are sex, family, and disability. The others will vary province from province. When we're discussing the duty to accommodate, it's also important to remember that employees are protected by privacy legislation, PIPEDA in Canada, and some specific ones in some provinces, which restricts an employer's access to their medical information. And we will talk about that a little bit also today. So the principles of duty to accommodate, there are three. There is the respect for dignity, individualization, and that's what I was referring to when I was saying, you know, it's on a case-by-case basis, as well as integration and full participation. And we will talk about that when we look at everyone's role in the process of duty to accommodate. A reasonable duty to accommodate is a balance between the rights of an employee and the rights of an employer to operate a productive workplace. And that's where the concept of undue hardship comes in. Employers are not expected to suffer undue hardship or create unnecessary jobs. So what does undue hardship really mean? It's defined as a significant difficulty or expense that is so extensive, substantial, or disruptive that it may alter the nature of the business. That's the definition of undue hardship. In that definition, the challenge is that there is huge room for interpretation, and that's where it gets dicey. What may be extensive, substantial, and disruptive for one employer is not for another. So again, it brings us back to that principle of individualization. Every accommodation that's being considered has to be considered for that specific employee. The accommodation that worked for Megan may not work for me because we're two very different people. We have unique realities, and those have to be respected in that duty to in that creation of the accommodation. Now, employers who argue undue hardship have to be able to prove it. So they have to be able to demonstrate that the accommodation would cause more than minimal or negligible cost on the general business operation, that it would reduce workplace safety, infringe on the employee's rights, or discriminate against others in the workplace. It would hurt employee benefits. It may lower job efficiencies in other areas of the business. The accommodation breaks other laws or impacts other employees and their health. So there's a lot that has to be considered before an employer can claim that the accommodation is causing undue hardship. When it comes to protecting an employee's privacy and medical information, keep in mind that employers are entitled to know about that their employee has a disability that requires an accommodation. They're entitled to know what the restrictions and limitations are or the employee's abilities, and what are the return to work guidelines. What employers are not entitled to is the diagnosis, the symptoms, or the treatment plan for that employee. So let's take a look at an example. We have an employee who provides a doctor's note to their employer stating that they've been feeling under the weather and need a leave of absence. This is where our first poll comes in. As an employer, what additional information would you be entitled to ask for? So take a few minutes, go to your Slido and mark your answer. Okay, I think we have everybody's answers. So the majority responded all of the above, and that's absolutely correct. When it comes to accommodations, employers are entitled to know if the absence is linked to a disability, what the employee's restrictions and limitations are, if the employee could be present at work with accommodations. So that's part of those discussions that you want to be having with your employees. Okay, you're not feeling well. What can we do to help you stay at work? Is there an accommodation that can be helpful? So those are discussions that are absolutely important to have. And of course, what is the expected return to work date when there is an absence from work? So let's dive into a little bit the why and how of accommodations. So consider this. Absences are costly. We know that, right? The longer the employee is off work, the harder it is to get them back to work. And the best tool we have is to accommodate employees so that they can return to work faster. So it's kind of a positive way to look at an accommodation. It's not something that you have to do. Well, you do, but it's a tool that you have at your disposal to help employees stay at work or return to work faster. So it really is a win-win for everyone involved. The benefits of accommodations. I don't know if anyone is familiar with the job accommodation network known as JAN. It's a US-based organization that specializes in accommodations. Their website, they offer services to employers, and they have a great website where you can go, sorry, where you can go and type in a difficulty an employee might be reported having, and it will give you examples of accommodations. Of course, then the next step is to look at the reality of the workplace and see what accommodations could work. So Jan works with employers, and they conducted a study to look at how satisfied employers were with accommodations that were recommended by Jan. And employers reported both direct and indirect benefits. Direct benefits were related to retaining valuable employees, improving productivity, improving morale, reducing workers' comps, fees, training costs, and also improving company diversity. So some of these direct benefits were actually a surprise to Jan. And what's really interesting are some of the indirect benefits that were reported by employers, namely that the accommodation ultimately improved interaction with coworkers. It improved, as I said before, company morale and company productivity. So this is good news. So in general, what we can take from that study is what's in it for employers when considering accommodations. Well, you retain valued and qualified employees. A lot of those, and we'll talk about this in the next slide, a lot of the accommodations are not costly, or the costs are minimal. Accommodations are effective. And those employers, they experience direct and indirect benefits after making accommodations. And these employers reported that Jan was extremely helpful during the entire accommodation process. So as I mentioned, accommodations are not costly, contrary to popular belief. A lot of people think accommodation, sit, stand, desk, fancy electronic equipment. Not necessarily. 59% of accommodations cost nothing, and the remaining accommodations are less than $500. So in the grand scheme of things, to keep an employee at work, an accommodation that would cost $500 is really worth it. It's a good, solid investment. So I'm curious to know, what is an accommodation to you? I gave you an example of the sit, stand, desk, so don't use that one. But in 1 to 3 words, give me examples of what you think are accommodations. We're going to create a word cloud with this. So if you're going to use more than one word to describe your accommodation, don't put any spaces between the words. That way, and maybe capitalize the first letter of this word so it'll be easier to read. So back to Slido. Absolutely. Yeah, flexible schedule is coming up a lot. What's interesting here, I'm seeing cannot lift over 25 pounds. That's a restriction. So an accommodation would be, what can we do? Can we remove that task that requires lifting 25 pounds? That would be an accommodation. So that's linked to modified duties. Yeah, flexible hours, flexible schedule are really the top ones. Oh, I like seeing that compassionate interaction, gradual return to work, accessibility, shorter shifts. Absolutely. And shorter shifts are part of that flexible modified hours concept. Yeah, you guys are pros at this. The frequent breaks, more breaks, absolutely. Collaboration, focus time, limit lifting, absolutely. These are fantastic examples of accommodations. And what's interesting here is that I'm looking quickly. When you look at these, there is no cost involved. You don't have to pay to implement these accommodations. Yes, it may require shifting things around, but when we're looking at cost, this is fantastic. Good job, everyone. So when we're looking at accommodation or some form of, and it may be more than one accommodation, it's really to assist employees to return to work within their functional abilities. The purpose of an accommodation is to provide access to employment opportunities and fair treatment in the workplace. So we can look at this in the concept of diversity and inclusion. Accommodations facilitate diversity and inclusion. So I'm guessing at this point, you might be wondering, how long can an accommodation last? And it's a very good question to be asking yourself. So when we're looking at the legislation, it is open-ended. The amount of time is not defined anywhere, except to say that, employees can be absent from work for years and still be entitled to request an accommodation for work. Again, every situation has to be analyzed on a case by basis. And once an accommodation is put in place, it doesn't guarantee that it will last forever, but there's no rule that says that there's a maximum amount of time. So again, here, and that's again part of what's challenging with accommodations, it could last forever. Employers could try and terminate the accommodation, but they have to be really careful that they're not in violation of the Human Rights Code. So again, we're going to link this back to that undue hardship. Do you have a reasonable, valid reason to put an end to the accommodation? So let's look at this example. While creating an accommodation plan for an employee who needs modified hours due to a medical condition, the employee tells you that every Friday morning, they need time off to drive their elderly mother to an appointment with the diabetic nurse, and there's no other family member who can do it. Whoops, sorry. Oh yeah, we're good. What is an appropriate response? I'm sorry, this is not related to your disability, and I can consider it when preparing your modified work schedule. Or, thank you for sharing this with me. I will ensure to consider your caregiving responsibility when developing your modified work schedule. Go back to Slido and mark your answer. Okay. So we have a majority for thank you for sharing this with me. And that is actually the appropriate answer. When we're looking at accommodating non-medical factors, so this is super important. This is not related to the person's disability, right? It's part of who they are, of their reality. There are protected grounds. So again, those protected grounds are religion, caregiving responsibilities, and family are part of those protected grounds. So it's always in the best interest of the employer to go through their internal accommodation review process to make these decisions. In these scenarios, DMI can help in determining if there are functional limitations that exist as a result of a medical condition, but we cannot advise as to whether the situation falls under alternate protected grounds. Employers will have to seek legal counsel on that topic to get a clear response. We unfortunately cannot give out that type of legal advice. So what is DMI's role in the accommodation process? Keep in mind that accommodations can be initiated by anyone, by the employee themselves, by the employer, by the case manager at DMI, by the work health consultant at DMI. However, it's important for us to remember that the liability and the duty to accommodate remains with the employer. So once the accommodation process has been initiated, DMI's role is to connect and engage all key stakeholders in the accommodation process. So basically, we're the ones making sure that everyone knows what's going on and that we're all on the same page. So we will assist with gathering functional information, occupational information that's relevant to reviewing the accommodation. Once DMI has gathered this information, then we're going to analyze the information and the impact that it has on the employee's ability to perform their job demands. And we're going to make recommendations for accommodations. So this is when, where we would like to have that conversation with you, the employer, with the employee, to brainstorm ideas, what could work, what is a challenge, and to have that open communication in discussing the accommodations. Our primary objective is to add value to the process, to act as a facilitator and communicator, protecting the rights and dignity of the employer while also supporting, the rights of the employee while supporting the rights, the employer in fulfilling their obligation to offer a reasonable accommodation. So when we're looking at the employer's role in creating an accommodation plan, let's keep in mind that what is super important is documenting everything. The accommodation plan needs to be put in writing and needs to be signed by all parties. It is a flexible document. It will be reviewed regularly. And this documentation is to show that the employer is in fact doing everything in their power to fulfill their duty to accommodate. It keeps all parties accountable. Communication preferences should also be outlined. This way, there are no surprises. The anticipated result, right? What are we hoping for? Return to work to the employee's full occupation with no accommodation, or is there something else that would be acceptable? The duration, when is this accommodation starting and when is it predicted to end? Again, this can be reviewed on a regular basis. the complexity, right? Be as detailed as possible to make sure that everyone that has a part to play in the accommodation process is clear on what is to be done. And finally, resolution. What are the next steps? When will this end? Are we looking at possibly a permanent accommodation? So really, again, here, no two plan will look alike, as it's going to be individualized for each and every employee. Accommodations and disability benefits. So accommodated duties can impact eligibility for benefits, for disability benefits, and the following elements are going to be taken into considerations. Namely, are accommodated duties considered permanent or temporary? Is the employee being accommodated in their pre-disability position or in an alternate role? How does the policy define total disability? Does the policy define a timeline to apply for benefits from the date of disability? When it comes to these questions, do reach out to DMI to discuss them on a case-by-case basis. Let's look at another example. Here we have Jessie, who's been absent from work due to degenerative disc disease. They are a healthcare aide who is unable to perform the duties of their role at a long-term care home, which requires frequent bending and lifting 50 pounds. Jessie is able to bend and lift up to 20 pounds on an occasional basis. The employer has offered to accommodate Jessie in the role of an HCA at an assisted living facility, which has lighter job demands in line with their medical condition. However, Jessie declines the accommodation, reporting that the alternate location is too far away from their home and the drive is too long. Instead, Jessie plans to submit an LTD claim as they have satisfied the long-term disability elimination period. Given the employer has offered an accommodation, will Jessie be entitled to LTD benefits? Right, take a moment, and for this one, write your answer in the chat, and we'll be looking at your very short one-word answer. We have a lot of no's coming up. A yes, a few yeses. Okay, this is excellent. So this example is actually a very good example because it opens the door to a slew of considerations. So it actually depends on what's in the contract. In this scenario, Jessie could be entitled to benefits or could not. It depends on the definition of disability, if it's for own occupation or own job. And this is definitely something that DMI can provide an opinion on. And what's interesting here when we're talking about duty to accommodate and the employer's responsibility in this is that personal preferences are not to be taken care of. The employer in this case have offered a reasonable accommodation. It is in Jessie's right to refuse it, but at this point, the employer has fulfilled their duty to accommodate. So here, whether Jessie will be entitled to benefits or not will be up to the case manager assigned to their claim to make that determination. For those of you who are in a unionized role, so for employees in a unionized environment, we need to add the union representative to the table and loop them into the discussions around accommodations. Unions do share a joint responsibility with the employer in the accommodation process. Return to work programs, accommodations should be consistent with the collective agreement. However, if it's not possible, the duty to accommodate legislation does supersede the collective agreement. Again, here, we strongly encourage you to seek legal input on this matter. Okay, so when employers can't accommodate, and this will happen because it would cause them undue hardship, employment conversations need to take place. These are challenging and complex discussions. And really what we encourage you to do is to have those discussions with your internal HR department or your outside resource such as legal advice, or even reaching out to the applicable human rights authority. When it comes to employees, in Jesse's example, Jesse refused an accommodation. They can definitely do that, but there is an expectation for employees to accept reasonable accommodations. That's in the legislation. But of course, here we come across the word reasonable. What's reasonable for me may not be for Eon. So it's another area of interpretation that needs to be taken into consideration. A reasonable accommodation is defined as being one that respects dignity, that responds to a person's needs, and allows for integration and full participation in the workplace. Here, when an employee refuses an accommodation, please be sure to document all those discussions and obtain the employee's refusal in writing. This is what you will be able to produce to demonstrate that you have met your responsibility to accommodate. In summary, I just want to go very quickly over your role as employers to with regard to the duty to accommodate. So very quick notes. As employers, you want to be sure to train your staff, your managers, your supervisors to be alert to an employee's needs. You see an employee struggling at work, reach out and start the discussion to see if accommodations could be in place. That's being incredibly proactive. And also, it shows that you're acting in good faith, that everything you do is for the benefit of the well-being of your employee. When needed, and sometimes those discussions can be very challenging and difficult, and no one really knows what could be a good accommodation, then don't hesitate and reach out to experts. I'm not saying DMI is an expert, but we will help you with the process, and we will find some experts that could help out with figuring out what the accommodation is. Sorry. Investigate. So again, it's not one person figuring out what the accommodation is. It is a team effort and it is a collaboration. Document everything. I cannot stress that enough. Documentation is critical. Communicating regularly and effectively. And the regularly, I want to stress this here. The accommodation is put in place. It's not, oh, it's an 8-week accommodation. We'll talk again in 8 weeks. No, we will follow up every week as regularly as possible to make sure the accommodation is effective. As employers, maintain the employee's confidentiality. Limit requests for information. What I mean by this is we've seen this with some employers who will bend over backwards in trying to get evaluations, functional abilities evaluations, medical, independent medical investigations. Those, even though employers can do that, it really puts a barrier in the entire concept of acting in good faith and promoting a good work environment. So trust your experts, trust your partners that the accommodations being proposed are the right ones for you and your employee. That collaboration with the employee is critical. They need to feel that they're part of the discussion and that you, the employer, takes their well-being at heart. Be timely in, accommodations 3 months later, do nothing for the employee. You see a need, act on it. If there is a cost to accommodations, fund the accommodation and the requests also for information. Now the floor is yours. I haven't been monitoring the chat, so I don't know if any questions came up in the chat, but the floor is yours and we will answer your questions. And I'm just going to put up the last slide with Megan and I's contact information. And here you also have the QR code here will lead you directly to our webpage. So for any general information or you're not sure who to contact for questions, for help, just go to our website, to our contact page, and someone will get back to you. So we're open for questions.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, feel free to either type them into the chat or you can use the reactions at the bottom of the Zoom window and raise your hand so that we know that you'd like to speak, and feel free to unmute or put on your video if you prefer. As mentioned at the top of the session, we will be sharing contact information, the recording and presentation slides with all registrants next week. So feel free to get in touch with Stephanie or Megan or anybody from CSBT at that point if today doesn't suit you.
Okay, so I'm seeing, okay, Megan, I see you answered the question around LTD. So thank you for that. How to contact us? Yep, the slide is there. Okay, what if an employee's position is a standalone position and the person cannot do the job? So that is an excellent question, and it's one of those scenarios where, and Natalie, don't hate me, but I can't give you an answer because we would have, this is where you would reach out to DMI, and depending where the employee is at, right? Are they in receipt of LTD benefits? Then you might want to reach out to your case manager. If they're in the early intervention phase, reach out to your early intervention specialist to have those discussions to see what could be done. And I can't give you an answer that will please you because it really has to be based on what the employee needs and what other constraints there. Oops, sorry about that. What other constraints there might be in the workplace. Is there any guidance or suggestions when a number of staff who are impacted by approved accommodations in place come forward with their union complaining of their schedules, stating it impacts their mental health and well-being, and that it is undue hardship on employees when they, oh boy, when they are negatively impacted by someone else's accommodation? We have 10 approved accommodations in place, and typically each accommodations would change 8 to 10 other employees' schedules to meet the accommodation request. Yeah, that is a huge challenge that you have. My recommendation here is, and that's what's tricky with accommodating one employee and impacting others. I think this is probably where you need to go back to the drawing board and loop in DMI, even seek, everyone sitting at one table to see how the workplace can be reorganized and how we can satisfy everyone's accommodations without impacting others. This here is where it could get costly, and costly in the sense that one of the solutions could be to hire temporary staff to pick up the slack. So obviously there would be a cost to that. But again, here, there is no one solution that fits everyone. This would have to be discussed and looked into with all parties present at the table.
I'll
Okay.
speak to that one a little bit as well. Something that's important to consider, you give the example of 10 approved accommodations. This is where we come into such a gray area, because is this in a workplace with 500 employees, or do you have 20 employees? The size of the organization will impact whether it would be considered undue hardship to the other employees. So that's where, yeah, so 70, and that's DMI can't specifically advise on whether it meets that threshold of undue hardship or not. So as Steph said, that's where you need to be having conversations with the HR department, and first of all, hopefully looking at what's possible for a solution. And if you're unable to reach one, that's where you're needing to seek that outside advice.
Jessica is asking if there is a staff with medical restrictions and we want to provide safe and suitable accommodation, can we change their hours and days of work to provide them shifts when we can? Absolutely. That's an example of accommodations for sure. Amelia wants another example of accommodations besides revised work schedule. Yeah, so revised work schedule is probably the easiest and the most popular one. I'm going to give you some examples of accommodations that are maybe a little out of the box, but that work very well when there are cognitive limitations. So someone, for example, who is having memory difficulties, concentration difficulties, which is something we often see when there's a mental health diagnosis, then we're looking at memory aids. If they have a schedule to follow, make sure that it's in writing. Instill a buddy system. For the first 2 weeks of the return to work, they're going to be following someone to, let's say they've been absent for a long time and they're coming back to work. Well, for the first few weeks, they have a buddy who's there, one contact person, someone they can shadow maybe for that first week to relearn the job. The first day might be only to refamiliarize yourself with the workplace, with some of the procedures, with, safety features, safety certification. those would be examples of accommodations that could be put in place that have nothing to do with the work schedule, because the employee could be back at work full time and these accommodations will be necessary. It may be a daily check-in with their supervisor. There might be a checklist of tasks that have to be accomplished for each, person they're taking care of. So these kinds of checklists are examples of accommodations. Carol is asking, we have many staff that ask for accommodations to work days and weekdays only. If we did this for all, we would have no staff for weekends. Yeah, I feel for you, Carol. We see that in our files also, where people are no longer wanting to work nights and weekends. Again, here, I'm going to throw it back at you. And does this create undue hardship? So again, here, this is where you need to go to HR or to external legal counsel to get an answer. And who knows, right? Is there a creative way that this can be worked around as an organization?
I'll speak to that as well. I think one of the first things I would ask is, why do they need to work weekdays versus weekends? Is it connected to a protected ground? Disability, caregiving, things like that. If it's a personal preference, not connected to a protected ground, then employers aren't obligated in the duty to accommodate legislation. It's just a request that maybe yes or no you can support. I think the other thing that's important to mention is that there are some job requirements which are considered bona fide occupational requirements that employers are not obligated to accommodate. And once again, I would seek outside input as to what would fall under the bona fide category in the specific situation, but they are reasonably necessary to the function being performed, adopted in good faith, and rationally connected to the job being performed. We look at that example of working weekends. Let's say someone was hired for a weekend only shift and they report that they're not able to work weekends. Perhaps working Saturday is a bona fide occupational requirement that even if they have a reasonable reason why they can't work it, it's not something you're able to accommodate.
Okay, Ruth. Oh, so Ruth, I'll come back to you, but Jessica is reacting to what Megan said about protected grounds. Okay, so let's just say that they need to take care of a family member. Are we able to ask for a medical note for a doctor? So again, here, what is your internal policy when accommodating employees around issues that are non-medical? If it's in your practice to ask for a medical note, then please do that. If it's not, then as an organization, you'll want to get together and seek advice from HR.
I see Victoria has a question about staff who sought accommodations for childcare, such as a modified schedule, and then asking if it's appropriate at a certain time to ask if the situation had changed and if the modification could change. And this answer applies to all accommodations. It's appropriate and important to have a designated time frame where all parties will come back and revisit. Things change, situations change. I would build that into the accommodation agreement that whatever's appropriate, every month, every year, you're going to re-look at the situation and determine if it continues to make sense.
Great, thank
And
you. Oh,
yeah, sorry,
yeah,
I just don't want to forget Ruth.
Sure.
I'm not sure I understand 100% what you're talking about when you say when a schedule needs to be changed, person with disability loses hours, he's not given a different date to work even if he's available, so he's reluctant to ask for time off although it's a part-time position. I'm not 100% clear what you mean here, so maybe that might be something you want to get in touch with DMI about to discuss that specific situation.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you, Stephanie, for and Megan for answering as many questions as you could. I know that we have a few more questions, but we are up to time now. So I just wanted to, thank you both, Stephanie Clement and Megan Derksen from the Disability Management Institute, and Janet Andrews, Ashley Weening, and Paul Wheeler from our valued strategic partners, CSBT, for hosting this amazing webinar today. And I learned a lot for sure. And based on the questions and the different situations that people seem to be encountering, I think we could definitely do another session on this topic in the new year at some point. But in between, if you'd like more information or have some questions that you'd like to have answered, we will be sharing, as I said, the recording of this webinar, access to the session slides, and contact information for Stephanie and Megan, so that you can ask your questions and see how DMI and CSBT might be of service to you and your members. So thank you once again for attending, and we hope you have a fantastic day. Take care.
And thank you for having us.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Have a great day, everyone.